The wind came down from the Zagros Mountains before dawn, cold and ancient, carrying dust that had witnessed empires rise and vanish before memory itself could hold them. It was 550 BC. A man stood on a ridge above the Median capital of Ecbatana, watching the last torches of a dying kingdom flicker in the valley below. His name was Cyrus, and he was not conquering a nation. He was awakening one. No civilization in human history has died more times than Iran, and no civilization has refused death more stubbornly, crushed by Greeks, swallowed by Arabs, shattered by Mongols, strangled by empires, bombed in the 21st century. And yet here it stands, the same language, the same fire, the same defiant soul burning beneath every conqueror's boot. This is not a story about kings and battles. This is a story about an idea that could not be killed. Before Cyrus, before Persia, before the name Iran meant anything to the outside world, there was the plateau, high, cold, and merciless, a vast table of stone and wind suspended between Mesopotamia and Central Asia, between the Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea. This was not gentle land. It did not forgive weakness. The civilizations that grew here grew hard, layered, and deeply aware that something was always coming from beyond the horizon. The Elamites had built cities here when Egypt was still young. The Medes had unified the western highlands in the 7th century BC, forging the first Iranian state from pastoral tribes who had learned that survival required solidarity. In 612 BC, the Median king Cyaxares brought down Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital, the most feared city on earth, and the shockwave was felt from Egypt to India. The world had a new center of gravity, and it was Iranian. But the Medes were only the prelude. Cyrus of Persia, from the small southwestern province of Pars, rose not with speeches or proclamations, but with movement. He did not wait for permission to be great. In 553 BC, he revolted against the Median king Astyages, his own grandfather by some accounts, and 3 years later he walked into Ecbatana not as a destroyer but as a successor. He did not burn the city. He did not enslave its people. He absorbed them. This act, small, almost quiet, contained the entire secret of what the Achaemenid Empire would become. What was at stake in 550 BC was not merely a throne. Every person on the Iranian plateau understood, in the way that ordinary people always understand before historians do, that something permanent was shifting. A unified Iran meant safety from the raiding wars that had bled villages for generations. It meant trade routes, stable harvests, predictable law. It meant, for the first time, the possibility of calling yourself something Persian, Mede, Elamite, without that name meaning you were someone else's prey. And, civilizationally, the stakes were even larger. The Iranian plateau sat at the crossroads of every major trade and migration route in the ancient world. Whoever controlled it controlled the conversation between East and West. Cyrus understood this with absolute clarity. He was not building an empire. He was building the world's first truly international civilization. Foreshadow this. In the 26 centuries that followed this moment, Iran would be conquered 5 more times. And 5 more times, the conquerors would eventually speak Persian, dream Persian dreams, and find themselves slowly, quietly, becoming Iranian. The Achaemenid Empire did not look like other empires of its age. It did not rule through terror alone. Cyrus issued what scholars now call the world's first declaration of human rights, a clay cylinder inscribed with the promise that conquered peoples could keep their gods, their languages, their customs. When he entered Babylon in 539 BC, he did not arrive as a destroyer. He presented himself as the city's liberator, restoring temples, freeing captives, walking the streets of the world's greatest city as a guest rather than an occupier. The Babylonians did not resist. They celebrated. His son Cambyses added Egypt. His successor Darius the Great, who seized power in 522 BC in circumstances still debated by historians, built the empire's skeleton. Roads stretching thousands of miles, a system of provincial governors called satraps, a postal relay network that could carry a message from Susa to Sardis in days. And then Persepolis. Rising from the Fars plain like a dream given weight and permanence, Persepolis was not merely a palace. It was a statement. Stone carvings depicted delegations from 23 nations bringing tribute not in humiliation but in ceremony, each wearing their own dress, carrying their own gifts, acknowledged as distinct peoples within one vast commonwealth. But no structure stands against time without a human force to defend it. In 334 BC, Alexander of Macedon crossed into Asia. He was 22 years old, brilliant, and furious with ambition. Over 3 years he dismantled the Persian Empire battle by battle Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, until Darius III fled into the eastern provinces and was murdered by his own men. Alexander walked into Persepolis in 330 BC, and in a night of wine and fire that historians still argue over, burned it. The greatest symbol of Iranian civilization collapsed into ash. The night before that fire, if we can pause here, if we can press our ear to the silence between historical records, imagine the Persian guards watching the Greek torches move through the palace halls, men who had served their king for decades, men whose grandfathers had walked the royal road from Susa to Sardis. They did not fight. They watched. Because they understood something Alexander did not yet know. You can burn a building. You cannot burn an idea. The Seleucid Greeks who followed Alexander tried to remake Iran as a Greek province. They failed. The Parthians, Iranian nomads from the northeast, drove them out within a century, ruling from 247 BC to 224 AD, and holding the Roman Empire at arm's length through 400 years of brutal, grinding warfare. The Romans called them the only enemy worthy of fear. Then came the Sassanids, who ruled from 224 to 651 AD, and created what many historians consider the apex of pre-Islamic Iranian civilization. Zoroastrianism, the ancient faith of Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, locked in eternal combat with Ahriman, the spirit of destruction became the state religion. Persian art, Persian administration, Persian philosophy flourished. The Sassanid Empire traded silk with China, debated theology with Byzantium, and built cities that dazzled the ancient world. But from the Arabian desert, something entirely new was coming, and it would change Iran more profoundly than Alexander ever had. The first collision. The Arab armies arrived in 637 AD carrying a revelation and a sword. At the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the exhausted Sassanid forces drained by decades of war with Byzantium broke and scattered. The last Sassanid emperor fled east and was murdered by a miller for the coins in his belt. One of the oldest empires on earth ended in the dust beside a roadside ditch. What happened next defied every logic of conquest. The Iranians converted to Islam, but they did not disappear into it. Instead, they bent it, stretched it, filled it with Persian poetry and Persian mathematics and Persian mysticism until Islam itself became partly Iranian. The Arab Abbasid caliphs, who ruled from Baghdad, the city built on Persian soil by Persian engineers using Persian administrative models, surrounded themselves with Iranian scholars, Iranian artists, Iranian bureaucrats. The conquerors needed the conquered to run everything. Within 2 centuries of the Arab invasion, the greatest poets writing in praise of Islamic civilization were writing in Persian. The greatest philosophers were Iranian. The greatest mathematicians were Iranian. The Iranian soul did not submit. It infiltrated. By 1501, the Safavid dynasty emerged from Azerbaijan carrying a revolutionary idea. Iran would be Shia Muslim, not the Sunni Islam of the Ottomans to the west or the Uzbeks to the east, but a distinctly Iranian interpretation of the faith, with its own martyrs, its own holy cities, its own passionate theology of suffering and redemption. Shah Ismail I rode into Tabriz and declared this before his armies had even sheathed their swords. It was an act of breathtaking political genius. Shia Islam became the wall that separated Iran from every neighbor. It became the new Persian identity, fused with the old one, fireproof and permanent. Shah Abbas I, ruling from 1587 to 1629, took this identity and built a civilization around it. Isfahan became his canvas. The great Naqsh Jahan Square, surrounded by mosques and bazaars whose tilework shimmered like frozen water under the desert sun, announced to every traveler on every trade route, "This is what Iran is. This is what Iran has always been. Come and see what a people who refuse to die can build." The black blood changes everything. Then came the 20th century. And oil. Reza Khan, a soldier, rough-edged, impatient with ceremony, seized power in 1925 and declared himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, founder of a new dynasty. He wanted to drag Iran into modernity the way a man might drag a reluctant animal by force, if necessary. He built roads, he built universities, he banned the veil, he replaced turbans with Western hats by decree. In the streets of Tehran, radio played foreign music. Women appeared in public without hijabs for the first time in generations. The clerics watched from their seminaries with cold, patient fury. But Reza Shah had miscalculated the world around him. In 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran and removed him too sympathetic to Germany. They said replacing him with his young son, Mohammad Reza Shah. The son was cultured, educated, deeply uncertain of himself, and surrounded by foreign powers who intended to keep Iran exactly as useful and exactly as weak as they needed it to be. Silence. Then, oil. In 1951, the Iranian parliament elected Mohammad Mossadegh as prime minister. He was 70 years old, brilliant, emotional in public, and absolutely convinced that Iran's oil belonged to Iran. He nationalized the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Britain and America went pale with fury. The CIA and MI6 began working the phones, the back channels, the money. In August 1953, agents paid Tehran street gangs to riot. Mossadegh's government collapsed in 48 hours. The Shah, who had fled to Rome in panic, returned in triumph on an American military plane. The lesson Iran received in 1953 was carved into the national memory with a blade. Sovereignty was an illusion. The West would always come for the oil. But, and this is the reversal that echoes through everything that followed Mossadegh's failure, planted something deeper than any political victory could have. It planted rage. It planted humiliation. It planted the certainty that the next revolution could not be a parliamentary one. It had to be total, absolute. Something no foreign intelligence service could reverse in 48 hours. 1979, the storm breaks. By 1978, the pressure had been building for 25 years. The Shah's secret police, Savak, had filled prisons with intellectuals, leftists, and clerics. The White Revolution of 1963 had modernized Iran economically while breaking its social fabric. Oil wealth had made Tehran glittering and obscene with inequality. And in the mosques, in the cassette tapes smuggled hand-to-hand across the country, the voice of a 76-year-old cleric living in exile in a French village was telling Iranians what they already felt, that their king was a servant of foreign powers, that Islam demanded justice, and that it was time. On the 1st of February 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini descended from an Air France 747 onto the tarmac at Mehrabad Airport. 5 million people lined the streets of Tehran. The noise was geological, not the sound of a crowd, but the sound of pressure releasing from tectonic plates. Women wept. Men threw flowers under the wheels of his car. Soldiers abandoned their posts and joined the procession. 10 days later, the military announced neutrality. The imperial state of Iran ceased to exist. It fell like a building without a foundation suddenly, completely, leaving nothing but dust and the question of what came next. What came next was not what most Iranians had marched for. Khomeini's vision, the Vilayat-e-Faqih, the governance of the Islamic jurist, sidelined every other faction within months. Leftists were imprisoned. Nationalists were silenced. Women who had marched in the revolution found themselves ordered to wear the hijab they had just fought against. The revolution devoured its own children with terrifying efficiency. And then Iraq invaded. War, blood, and the forging of iron. On the 22nd of September 1980, Saddam Hussein's armies crossed the Iranian border, expecting to capitalize on the revolution's chaos. He was wrong about the chaos being weakness. What he had actually done was give Khomeini exactly what every revolutionary government needs: an external enemy to unite a fractured population. 8 years, 1 million dead. Children given plastic keys to heaven and sent walking across minefields ahead of the infantry. Trench warfare that recalled the worst of 1916 on the Western Front, but with chemical weapons added to the horror. Iranian teenagers charging into Iraqi artillery barrages, shouting prayers. The air smelled of burned metal and something worse, the particular sweetness of mustard gas, which blistered the lungs and left men drowning in their own bodies. But Iran did not collapse. The Islamic Republic was tempered in that furnace into something that could not be burned again. When the ceasefire finally came in 1988, Iran had not won the war. It had survived it. And survival, for Iran, had always been enough. The road to 2025. Khomeini died in 1989. Ali Khamenei, a mid-ranking cleric who few considered a towering figure, became supreme leader and surprised everyone by lasting. Iran rebuilt slowly, patiently, funding proxy forces across the Middle East, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Houthi fighters in Yemen spinning a web of influence that reached from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. And beneath the ground, in fortified tunnels drilled through mountain rock, Iranian engineers enriched uranium. Not weapons, the government said. Never weapons. But the centrifuges spun faster every year, and by December 2024, the IAEA reported stockpiles of highly enriched uranium with no credible civilian explanation. In January 2026, 5 million Iranians filled the streets of every city in the country, the largest protests since 1979, screaming about food prices, about unemployment, about the gap between the revolution's promises and the reality of crumbling hospitals and worthless currency. The government answered with gunfire. Thousands died in the crackdown of January 8 through 10. The Islamic Republic looked, for the first time in decades, genuinely mortal. The strikes began at dawn. Nearly 900 American and Israeli precision weapons fell on Iran in the first 12 hours of what the United States called Operation Epic Fury, targeting missile batteries, nuclear facilities, air defense systems, and the men who commanded them. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the first wave. The Minister of Defense, the commander of the Revolutionary Guard, men who had held Iran's power structure in place for decades gone, simultaneously, before the morning call to prayer finished echoing across Tehran. Iran's retaliatory missiles streaked across the Middle East, toward Israel, toward American bases in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Jordan. Dozens killed in Tel Aviv. An Iranian ballistic missile punched through a residential building in the darkness like a fist through paper. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 1/5 of the world's oil flows, was declared closed. Oil prices broke $100 a barrel within hours. In Tehran, the streets were empty and burning. Government buildings poured black smoke into a sky that had turned a sickly orange. The Supreme Leader's portrait, which had hung on every public wall in Iran for 37 years, lay torn and trampled in the gutters of Vali-e-Asr Avenue. The great administrative machine of the Islamic Republic sat paralyzed, leaderless, like a body still warm but no longer breathing. No single figure had emerged to take command. No new supreme leader had been named. For the first time since 1979, Iran had no center. The outcome, regime survival, collapse, or something the world had no category for, yet remained violently, dangerously unresolved. Step back from the smoke. Step back from the burning portraits and the broken missiles and the empty palaces. What you are looking at is not a crisis. It is a pattern. Cyrus built the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and Alexander burned it in a single night. The Sassanids reached the peak of Iranian civilization, and the Arab armies swept them away in a decade. The Safavids made Iran the most culturally brilliant nation in the Islamic world, and a century of decline and invasion followed. The Pahlavis modernized Iran faster than any nation in history, and the people rose up and tore the whole structure down. The Islamic Republic outlasted every prediction of its death until, perhaps, it didn't. Each time, Iran ended. Each time, Iran continued. Because Iran is not a government, not a dynasty, not a flag or a constitution or a supreme leader's photograph on a wall. Iran is the Persian language spoken by 100 million people. Iran is Rumi and Hafez, whose poems are still memorized by schoolchildren in villages with no electricity. Iran is the memory of Persepolis, which Alexander burned but could not erase, because the Iranians simply rebuilt it in their minds and carried it forward through every conquest and catastrophe for 25 centuries. The Strait of Hormuz is closed today. The supreme leader is dead. The Islamic Republic may be dying. But somewhere on the high Iranian plateau, the wind is still coming down from the Zagros Mountains, cold and ancient, and indifferent to whoever currently claims to rule the land below. Centuries later, when the dust of this moment settles, historians will argue about what Iran chose in 2026. They will debate the causes and the consequences, the missed negotiations and the miscalculations, the oil and the uranium and the missiles. But they will reach the same conclusion that every historian of Iran reaches, eventually, about every chapter of this story. The land outlasted the conquerors. The language outlasted the dynasties. The idea outlasted everything. Some things cannot be bombed into extinction.